Well, friends, can we turn now for a few moments to that passage that we read together, the Gospel according to Luke in chapter 12. We'll read just now at verse 6. I want to take in the wider context, but we'll read at verse 6. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? Luke 12:6. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? In the previous chapter, Jesus was speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees. But here in chapter 12, he's speaking about the scribes and the Pharisees. And he's warning us about them. Now, this isn't the first time or the only time that the Lord does this in the gospel. He does so often enough. Sometimes he warns us about their doctrine. Beware of their doctrines, because their doctrines are dangerous. But in this passage, it's not the doctrines of the scribes and the Pharisees that he is warning us about, but it's something else that's on the Lord's mind, and we'll see in a minute what that something else was. Now, as we come to the passage, I want to look at 2 things tonight with you. 2 things that Jesus gives us here in these verses. And we'll notice, first of all, that Jesus gives us a warning. Jesus gives us a warning. Indeed, he gives us several warnings, one after another. Now, if you look at verse 5, verse 4 rather, we'll find the nub of the matter there. I say unto you, my friends, be not afraid of them that kill the body, and after that have no more that they can do. Well, we know who he means there. He just means ordinary people, ordinary men and women too, perhaps, who might kill your body. But he said that's all they can do. Verse 5, but I will forewarn you whom you shall fear. Fear him which after he hath killed hath power to cast into hell. Yea, I say unto you, fear him. In other words, be afraid of God. Be afraid of the Lord. Now, I'm in danger here of actually getting ahead of myself, and I'll have to be careful. Jesus is not saying here that we should have no fear of people who might attack us, in the sense that we have no concern, no thought, no preparation, no self-defense. That's not what he's saying. We can take that the wrong way, can't we? We are to be wise. We are to use our minds and the common sense which God has given us, and we are free to defend ourselves when the occasion might arise. So what is Jesus saying? Well, he's simply saying this, that fear, the fear of man, if we can put it in that most general way, the fear of man should not be the primary and foremost fear in our lives. There are other things that we should fear far more. And in the context here, Jesus tells us about 2 things we should fear more than we fear man. What are the 2 things? Well, first of all, Jesus says, be afraid of sin. Be afraid of sin. Now, often in the Bible, Jesus, of course, the Lord often says that. But here, in this context, it's one sin in particular. And you'll have noticed in our reading what sin Jesus is warning us to be afraid of. It's the hidden sin of hypocrisy, which the scribes and the Pharisees were particularly guilty of. Verse 1, beware, verse at the very end of the verse, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Be afraid of the sin of hypocrisy. By hypocrisy, we understand, of course, dishonesty, deception, an interest in the outward without any interest in the inner heart. This was what characterized the scribes and the Pharisees. They were exceptionally careful about outward rules and regulations. You remember, they had added to God's commandments and God's law about 600 rules of their own. It was almost impossible to keep them. They were extremely careful about these things to the point of unhelpful obsession. And at the same time, they were extremely careless about their hearts and how things were in their heart before God. Jesus talks of them as being those who wash the outside of the cup, and it looks pretty good, but they didn't bother with the inside. Now, verses 2 and 3 expose the danger and the folly of hypocrisy, and I'm not going to go into that tonight, but he tells them that, look, he says, there's no use in pretending, because the day is going to come when every pretense is going to be exposed by God. Be afraid of hypocrisy. In other words, seek before God to be sincere. To be sincere. Have sincerity. Now, I've told you before where the word sincere comes from, and you'll forgive me if I go back over it again. It's made up of two words, actually, sine cere, without wax. And it's a reference to the practice that they had in Jesus's time of making, they would have clay pots, of course, that's all they had. And part of the problem with these pots was that they were very easily cracked. If they fell or if they bumped against something, they're cracked and they're ruined. Now, what unscrupulous market stall holders would do, if some of their goods got damaged, nobody's going to buy a cracked pot. They would melt some wax and they would smear the wax over the crack. So it looked as though it was fine. You thought you were buying a perfect product. You took it home, of course, you heated up the pot, the wax melts, the crack is there, and it probably leaks. And some market stall owners would put up a sign just to reassure you, without wax. Well, that's the very phrase that the apostle, for example, in Philippians, lifts. And he says, let your lives be without wax. Let them be sincere. Let them be what we claim to be. And Jesus here is on the same topic. Be sincere. I think it's Spurgeon, C.H. Spurgeon, who speaks very helpfully of sincerity as being free from contradiction, in the sense that our inner life is the same as our outward life. Now, none of us is perfect on this. But there's a great difference between the believer who stumbles into sin at times and their inward life is a contradiction of their profession. There's a great difference between that person who stumbles into that sin and the person who is a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character, who is one thing outwardly and another thing inwardly. Beware of such a spirit. Again, I think it's Spurgeon, it's somebody else, it doesn't matter. But they're speaking about this, and they go on to apply it a little. And they say, you might have somebody who can quote the Bible from beginning to end, and do all sorts of things, maybe pray eloquently and do all sorts of things like that, and they look as though they are a model Christian. But he says, follow them back home. See if there's any contradictions, glaring contradictions in how they speak and how they act when the door is shut. Well, as I say, who of us is free from such contradiction? Follow them home, follow them to work, he says. Are they hardworking and honest? Or do they have one face for the church and another face for their workplace? Well, who of us is perfect in that? Not one of us, by a country mile. But it's one thing to be content with that and to live with that, like the scribes and the Pharisees, and say, well, I'll have this dual personality, as it were. It's another thing to mourn over it and to seek before God to be free from contradiction, to be without works, to be sincere and honest before God and man. Again, I came across an illustration about this recently, and it was quite helpful. The person who was writing said, you know, we can try our best to live as we should before our fellow believers and before the world. And that's right. Of course it is. But he said, I sometimes wonder how much of it is I'm doing, how much of this I'm doing simply because other people are watching. Now, in a very real sense, the fact that other people watch us is part of our keeping. The late Reverend Callum MacLean often used to make that point. He said the fact that the eyes of the world are on you is in God's providence, it's a part of your keeping, and you should be thankful for it. But there should be more than that. And this person went on to illustrate it like this. He said, what would happen if everybody else around you suddenly went deaf and dumb and blind, so that they couldn't see you anymore, so that they couldn't hear you anymore, so that they couldn't speak anymore? Would your life just continue on in the same way? Or would you change? Would you grow careless just because you're not able to hear me anymore and you're not able to see me anymore? So I think to myself, I can do what I like. Well, where there is sincerity, where there is a non-Pharisaic spirit, even if there was nobody watching, we press on, striving after holiness. Holiness, we were singing in Psalm 93, forever, Lord, thy house becometh well. And as we were reminded earlier, that holiness is our response to the promptings of the Spirit of God. Is that how we live? Responsive to the promptings of God. If people are watching us, well, that's good. That's a good testimony. But even if nobody is watching us, it's still the same. You'll forgive me if I give you one other illustration. It's one of the Puritans who put it like this. You know, sometimes the way you'll find outside, you won't find it outside modern hotels because they don't go in for it, but the old country inns, they would have their name quite often hung on a plaque, I suppose you would call it, on chains, you know. They might be called the horseman, and they might have a picture of somebody on a horse, or some name like that. And the name of the place, there's a wee picture on the old inn. Well, he said, imagine if you went to a country inn and the picture on the plaque was an angel. You think, well, this looks quite a good place. But you go inside and the devil is the landlord. The plaque and what's inside doesn't measure up. Well, again, that's the same thing. And to go back to Spurgeon, you know, he used to pray, Lord, if I'm not genuine, make me genuine today. If everything in the past has been ungenuine, make me genuine today. And isn't that a mark of grace? Make me genuine today. If I've deceived myself, then undeceive me, Lord, in mercy now. Now, of course, that's exactly what the scribes and the Pharisees didn't want. They were quite happy to go on as they went. The believer, like Paul in Romans 7, is constantly struggling with it. Wretched man that I am, you see your own contradictions far more than anybody else sees them. And they wound you far more than they wound anybody else. Oh, that's grace. Pressing on, knowing that holiness forever, Lord, thy house become well. And striving to be more and more responsive to the leading and the prompting of the Spirit of holiness. Now you notice he calls it leaven. That's because of its tendency to swell and infect everything. The spirit of the Pharisee lives in our fallen human nature, and even in the seasoned Christian, we are not safe from its effects. The plague is about us on every side. So Jesus gives us a warning. Be afraid of sin. Be afraid especially of the sin of hypocrisy. Now that's taken much longer with this than I intended, but there's a second warning he gives us, and I'll deal with it very quickly. Be afraid of sin. Secondly, be afraid of God. Verse 5, I will forewarn you whom you shall fear. Fear him after he has killed his power to cast into hell. You fear men and women. Well, says Jesus, remember, far more important than that is the fear of God. Stand in awe of God. Now, he's speaking here to the disciples, and we saw a couple of weeks ago, did we not, in Acts 4, exactly the way the disciples applied this. They're before the authorities, and the authorities say, you're not to preach or teach anymore in the name of Jesus. And Peter says, you've given us a problem. And here's our problem. You judge whether it's right to obey you or obey God. Who should we be afraid of, Peter is saying? You or him? And of course, Peter goes on to demonstrate that he was in awe of God far more than he was in awe of the Sanhedrin. There's another illustration of this in Hebrews 11, speaking about Moses. Hebrews 11:27. We're told there that Moses did not fear the wrath of the king. Why not? Because he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's a lovely verse, isn't it? He endured as seeing him who is invisible. Fear sin. Fear God. And Christ, of course, is the best example of all. He who must be about his Father's business, arm yourselves with the same mind. The fear of man is a great obstacle, and the best remedy for it is a fear of God. And you notice there's a repetition in verse 5. I say unto you, fear him. So we are to fear sin, and we are to fear God. But this God is not a God of terror that we're terrified of because we don't know at any moment which way he might turn, like the idol gods of the heathens, or even the God of our own day. The goddess of nature has really increased in, what's the word I'm looking for? Significance in our generation. Mother Earth. That strange phrase, Mother Earth. There's a generation growing up, and that's the only God they know is Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is very unpredictable. And Mother Earth has to be appeased. It's incredibly pagan, the whole thing, actually. You're going back hundreds of years. But our God is not an uncertain, capricious God like that, but a God of grace and a God of kindness. And Jesus illustrates that for us when he speaks about the sparrows. Or to put it another way, alongside the fact that Jesus gives us a warning, secondly, Jesus gives us an encouragement. Jesus gives us an encouragement. Verse 6 and 7, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings? He's put them on their guard. But now he's encouraging them. How often the Lord does that. He balances our needs in such a gentle way. Now, sparrows, we all know what sparrows are. Sparrows and other small birds were often caught and eaten in Jesus' day, and they were part of the commerce as well. They were part of the sacrifices too, but I mustn't get into that just now. Now, the main point that Jesus is making here is that the sparrows were little. They're little. Can I suggest 3 ways in which they're little? First of all, they were of little importance. They were of little importance. Verse 6, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings? Didn't need a lot of money to get a handful of sparrows. They weren't really very important. But Jesus is saying God sees them as important. Even the very least of his creatures, none of them are outside his sphere of care and concern. He knows exactly how many there are. He pays attention to each and every one of them. None of them dies or falls to the ground, unbeknown to him. They're not forgotten before God. They build their nests in his sight. They hatch their young under his eye. And Jesus is saying, look, if the sparrows are under the hand of God and they're not very important, you be assured that you are also under his hand. He sees his people as important. Verse 7, you are of more value than many sparrows. You're not forgotten. You're not overlooked. Or we acknowledge God in the great events, don't we? He's there in the great storms, but he's there in the tiny splash of water. He's there in the great tornado, but he's there in the wave that just broke in the water down by the water's edge there a minute ago. He's there in the mighty flood, and he's there in the drop of rain that just came off the roads and the guttering of the church. He's there in the sense of being in control of it, watching over it and ordering it. Not a drop of water falls outside of his providential knowledge and care. He's there in the pandemic, but he's also there in the tiny details of your life. He's there in the interplanetary movements, but he's there as well in the tiniest atom. God is at work. God is supervising and ordering the very hairs of your head. Verse 7, are all numbered, and their number changes constantly. The sparrows are of little importance, but they're important to the Lord. And he argues from the lesser to the greater. If the sparrows are so important, you are of more value than many sparrows. They're of little importance. Secondly, they are of little power. What can they do? They can't pull a heavy load. They're very limited in what they can do. But they had power in their own way to glorify God. And God gives that power to his people too. You have little power, maybe. And maybe you feel it more with the passage of the years. You say, there's less and less I can do. Oh, friend, he's left you here for a reason, to glorify himself. He's put you where you are for a reason, to glorify himself. You have very little power, but he has all power. He's able to guard these sparrows, so that when a mighty eagle would swoop in, if God so wills, the sparrow is saved. I was reading the other day of two men who went hunting. I think it was a long time ago, but I'm not entirely sure. And one of them went to sleep. And in his sleep, he had a very vivid dream. And he was one of these people who gets caught up in their dream and who sometimes does things in their dream. The other fellow couldn't get to sleep. Tossed and turned and tossed and turned. Eventually he got up. They were sleeping, I think probably in a tent outside. I should have said that. He couldn't get up. He said the door of the tent looking out and probably fed up. And the other fellow becomes more agitated in his dream. And suddenly the other fellow grabs his knife, which was beside him. In his dream, he's obviously still hunting. And he takes the knife and he slams it into the very place where his friend had been lying just moments before. The Lord had kept him awake. He put into his mind the thought of moving to the door of the tent. He didn't have the power to do that. The Lord had the power. He has the power to give you sleep and sometimes not to give you sleep. They were of little importance. They were of little power. Thirdly, they were of little value. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings? Now, there's an interesting verse in Matthew 10, if I can find it. Matthew 10 and 29. Listen to this. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? So you get 2 for a farthing. But here it says you'll get 5 for 2 farthings. In other words, they were of so little value that if you bought 4, they'd probably throw in another one. Buy 4, get 1 free. They're not worth much. For 2 farthings, you'll get 5. But God values them. And more importantly, he values his people. They are bought with a price. And oh, what a price that is. What a price that is. He loves his people with an everlasting love. Blood was shed for them, and it's the blood of his Son. Promises are given to them, and it's the promises of God. A work has begun in them that will be completed on the day of Jesus Christ. Oh, yes, Jesus gives us a warning, but he also gives us an encouragement. You are of more value than many sparrows. Maybe you feel downcast and weak and hopeless tonight. Maybe you feel, well, I'm almost at the point of giving up. Maybe the enemy is saying, even the Lord doesn't notice your problems. This verse is for you. You are of more value than many sparrows. So, Christian, like a little sparrow, you fly to the shelter of God. Like a little sparrow, you attend to his work, whatever it is he's given you to do. Like a little sparrow, you sing his praise on the housetop as much as you can. And like a little sparrow, as we're going to sing in a minute, you build your nest in his altars. You are of more value than many sparrows. May God bless his word. We'll sing in Psalm 84, which speaks of this very matter for us. We'll sing verses 1 to 3, down to the end of the double verse 3 there. How lovely is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me. And then down to verse 3, behold, the sparrow findeth out an house wherein to rest. The swallow also for herself hath purchased a nest, even thine own altars, where she saith, her young ones forth may bring. Isn't that a lovely picture of bringing the young ones into the altar of God, into the house of God, into the things of God? O thou almighty Lord of hosts, who art my God and King. 4 stanzas, how lovely is thy dwelling place.
Lovely is thy dwelling place, O hosts to me.
O thou almighty Lord of hosts, who art our God and King, help us to remember the word, to lay it up in our hearts, and practice it in our lives. And now may grace, mercy, peace from the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, rest on and abide with you all, now and forevermore. Amen.